All right, we're just going to take a minute before we get started to make sure we get a few more people signed on, and then we'll start our broadcast. All righty, we're going to get started now. Thank you all for joining us today for our Registrar Cosmetics webinar. I'm really excited to talk about this topic with you with our presenter, Jacqueline Belomo. Our topic today is Don't Become EU Non-Compliant, Understanding the 51st Amendment of IFRA Standards Enforcement on October 30th, 2025. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today. We have Jacqueline Belomo, a cosmetics consultant with a diverse background in the cosmetics industry, spanning formulation, regulatory compliance, and product and quality management. She's a seasoned, respected key figure in the cosmetics industry, and she is simply an outstanding public speaker, and I'm sure you'll agree with me as you listen to her presentation. One more thing before we get started, before we get through our webinar content, I want to introduce a newer addition to Registrar Corp, Personal Care Regulatory, which became part of the Registrar Corp business in December 2024. Together, Registrar and PCR combine our teams of experienced toxicologists and regulatory specialists. Together, we provide seamless end-to-end compliance services across the UK, EU, and US. PCR is a leading cosmetics regulatory toxicology and compliance company based in locations both of the United Kingdom and Ireland, specializing in both the EU and UK. In this webinar, we'll review what you need to know regarding the IFRA Standard 51st Amendment and include details on how Registrar and PCR can help you to be compliant. Now I'll hand it over to Jacqueline.
Thank you so much, Anne. Welcome, everyone. This is a really exciting topic for me for a couple of reasons. I love talking about flavors and fragrances. Many of you that maybe heard me speak before, I have a deep, obsession with fragrances and allergens and how that all works together. With this new amendment, it's really important to understand why these changes are going to affect most of us who have been in industry for a very long time, 20 years ago. I think this is like lightly talked about, but it's becoming more and more relevant to really understand how IFRA works, how it impacts our products, especially in the cosmetic industry. And as we go through today, you're going to see some other items that are going to be affected and are affected by these standards and amendments that are being made that could potentially, cause issues in your product line that you might not think so. So we're going to go through who is IFRA, what are the IFRA standards, how are they regulated, who must comply, and then of course the IFRA 51st Amendment. We'll go through the timeline, the key provisions, impacts, challenges, and then of course enforcement of the EU, and then how we can help, right? I mean, that's why we're all here, right? How can we help make sure that you stay compliant? So who is IFRA? So IFRA is the International Fragrance Association. They're a global representation. They're a body for the fragrance industry. It was established in 1973 to ensure the safety and sustainability of fragrance materials used in various products. We're going to focus a lot today on, cosmetics and personal care, but you'll see there's fragrance in everything, right? Dryer sheets, for instance, is a huge one. Paper products, right? So, the functions of IFRA really are to develop these safety guidelines, compliance and regulations, and advocacy, right? We tend to always lean that, government body, global representation bodies of this nature are there to restrict us, right? We're another regulation coming out, another allergen to report, right? We want to look at it a little differently today. We want to look at this amendment as a way of moving forward, right? To protect the overall users of these products and to protect the brand, right? Before a lot of these standards were put into place, there was a lot of reactions to certain fragrances and flavors that are being used in products. There was a whole movement for Gross products, right? And what it means to have these types of fragrances and flavors on our skin. I have seen more reactions in the last, 5 years than I have in the last 20, right? And that is because, we are pushing the limits of our fragrances and flavors. And is so much to be said about how a fragrance and a flavor makes you feel, right? And that is a lot what has to do with our cosmetic and our personal care products, right? We love to smell the lavender. We love to smell the coconut. We love to smell the pineapple, right? And we love those high levels, right? Because it brings a type of happiness, a good feeling, right? But we need to make sure that those levels are safe to be used, right? The last thing we want is to launch a beautiful body wash that smells like a tropical beach, and yet everyone's having a type of sensitization to it from the levels that are being used or the type of fragrance ingredients that are in it. So, what are the IFRA standards? These are globally recognized risk management system for the safe use of fragrance ingredients. Each ingredient and each material has safety criteria to it. And this is all based on scientific knowledge and testing. I want to say that, a lot of fragrance houses, and I've worked with all of them, the safety testing and the data behind their information is really sound. And there is such extensive testing, analytical and safety testing done on fragrance materials, especially in the EU, that gives us the ability to have the foresight to know what type of fragrance materials could potentially cause a safety concern or a safety issue. And this really ties into the ingredients that may pose potential health risks or cause an adverse reaction in consumers. And we've talked about this before in other webinars. The US, is moving on the same path of other countries of understanding that fragrance itself has a higher risk to cause serious adverse reactions, health concerns, and that is because of the skin reactions that people have using some of these irritants. And I'm going to say irritants, but fragrance is known to have irritants in it. It's known to have allergens in it. And we need to understand that. And those standards really help us understand that and have it backed by that scientific knowledge. A lot of the discussions that were happening with FDA about fragrance allergens, right? The biggest request that came from industry was when you make a list of fragrance allergens, make sure that you have the scientific data, the scientific knowledge to back up why that allergen is being added to the list. And I think that's really important coming from a science background, a technical background, to understand how there is science behind this, right? We're not just picking fragrance ingredients and fragrance materials and saying, okay, this is a known allergen or this is causing allergen without having that data to back it up. The standards, right? They help standardize, right, across the board. One of the most frustrating, pieces in cosmetic compliance and cosmetic, regulatory is that there is so many different standards across the board. And I just don't mean from like a governmental standpoint. I mean from like a retailer standpoint as well. We have a lot of things that we have to keep track of, right? A lot of restrictions, a lot of levels, a lot of limits, and it can become overwhelming if especially on the fragrance side of this, that it wasn't standardized across the board, right? So we're talking about restriction of the quantitative limit on use of a fragrance ingredient, prohibiting the use of a fragrance ingredient in any final product application, and then specification on the use of a fragrance ingredient, such as like a purity requirement. This kind of levels the playing field for everyone to completely understand the type of restrictions, prohibited, and specifications that are needed for a fragrance. A lot of the amendments, we're on the 51st one, right? So it keeps changing throughout the time. A a lot of these the standardized restrictions, prohibited, right? As we learn more, or as fragrance develop more, and move into different innovations and different techniques and different technologies, this is where we have to keep making sure that we stay on top of this, right? Our products now out of compliance with these new standards that keep changing. And that is, again, how we have to understand how this is regulated. So IFRA standards, IFRA self-regulates the safe use of these fragrance ingredients. It is evaluated at the Research Institute of Fragrance Materials, also known as the RIFM, and you're going to hear that throughout this presentation. This is the institute, right, that has the safety assessments. These are the experts, right? These are the people that put the science behind the standards, the science behind the restrictions, the science behind what gets prohibited, right? There's also an independent expert panel. There's member companies, and then it also consists of multi-stakeholder standard setting process. And that's really important. We're going to talk through that as well. And there's over 263 standards for safe use of fragrance ingredients. So there is a lot of thought, there is a lot of science, and there is a lot of experts behind this. And it's really important to say that because, when we look at the bigger picture of fragrance and the potential health risk and adverse events that could occur, right? This is the team. This is how we protect, the consumer, protect the brand from misuse of any of these fragrance ingredients that this expert panel or the Institute for Fragrance Materials evaluates from a safety perspective. And you're going to hear me say safety a lot. And I think that's really key here because this particular amendment is going into making sure that we continue to evaluate fragrance materials and fragrance ingredients, as well as how those are used in a final product and where they're used, right? That's really key to understand. So the standard setting process is not as easy as you would believe it to be. There is a process that goes into play. There is a timeline. We're going to walk through that. But the first step is that IFRA sends the information to the RIFM, right? So IFRA has this information about fragrance materials. They have concerns that, certain materials need to be restricted, in some cases prohibited, in some cases the limits need to be changed, right? So they send this information to the Institute to have them to review. That Institute then prepares a dossier, right? And this is where they come into the scientific knowledge part, and they go through the steps of why this restriction should be updated, why this fragrance material should be prohibited, why we should add more clarification to a particular category, why, right? And this is where they take the science and have these standardized practice of taking the science and supporting the change, right? After that, the expert panel evaluates. And this is really important, right? Because these are industry people. This is people from the industry that understand the fragrance, understand the science, understand the products, right? IFRA then prepares the standard based off of all of this. There is a consultation phase, right? And this is where IFRA will have comments brought in and understand what it will take and what effect that this change will have on industry. And that is really, really important for them to understand because it also works out the timeline for the notification process as well. And then lastly, the publication and implementation. For new products, there is a shorter, implementation timeline. IFRA knows that existing products out in the market that need to be changed or updated will have a lengthier process, and they give them that time. Not as much time as you would like, and not as much time as you would think, but it's very important that these timelines they understand. And just like with any regulation that is a huge change, right? There's a whole implementation process and timeline that has to get followed, and they have to understand that industry needs that time, right, to make those changes. We are talking about cosmetics and personal care. It gets a little bit more complex when we move into other categories, and we'll talk about that a little bit because there is a lot of overlap. But basically, who needs to comply with the IFRA standards is the big question probably everyone has, right? Does this apply to me? So all fragrance consumer products are in the scope of IFRA standards. And it covers all of them in the safety assessment as well. And this now includes leave-on and rinse-off products as well. I want to talk about particular, the products, for cosmetics in scope would be your fragrance, your makeup, even baby creams, oils, personal care items, oral care products, and OTCs that are regarded as cosmetics, right? So your SPFs, your acne cleansers, things of that nature. Anything that contains a fragrance is in this scope. And you might think, well, I only have 0.02. Like, how could that, be in that scope? But it is. And you'll know if you've ever seen a large fragrance dossier, right? It comes with a fragrance safety evaluation, right? It comes with the IFRA standards. It comes with the categories, right? And that comes all really important for your finished good. So best example I give you is if you have a lip balm and you have a flavor and that flavor's IFRA restriction is 0.25, you cannot go above that IFRA recommendation for the limit of that fragrance being used in your lip balm, right? Because it falls in a certain category and that category has a certain limit. That is where all of this gets a little complex, and having to really understand from the safety assessment perspective, the product perspective, the product limit use perspective, how that all comes into play. And this is why it's so, so important if you have products that you're selling in the EU that are fragranced, that you have the evaluation done if you are compliant with the IFRA 51st Amendment. Getting into that timeline that we talked about. So the notification date, right, is when we just talked about the standard setting process. The notification date was June 30th, 2023 for the 51st Amendment. This is where the IT systems get updated. There's exchange of information, and all of that happens as the notification date. All briefs submitted before this January 30th, 2024 are classified as existing creations. Now, what that means is your existing fragrance, your existing makeup, everything that was already on market, already done, is considered existing. October 30th, 2023, right? Evaluate the impact of the 51st Amendment on fragrance mixtures and share relevant information with customers. So this is anyone in the fragrance industry making fragrance and having to understand now that this new update also has to comply with their fragrance materials and their fragrance ingredients. January 30th, 2024, another big date to remember. All briefs submitted after January 30th, 2024 are classified as new creations. This is where I was speaking about the different types of timelines and the different types of implementation, right? Because now you've seen that customers and fragrance industries are all given the updated IFRA standards, right? And the new compliance that they need to follow. So all these new creations from that January 30th, 2024 date are going to have to comply with IFRA 51st Amendment by that March 30th, 2024 date. So new creations had very, very little time, but at this point, right, as you can see from the June 30th, 2023 to the January 30th, 2024, this whole information was being provided and being given to industry and given to the fragrance houses of how they need to make their amendments to their current IFRA paperwork and standards, right? So it's really important to, and I want to just call this out, when you're working with fragrance houses, flavor houses, right? This is a document that you ask for, right? I need the IFRA 51st Amendment document. It is different from your EU allergens list, right? This is a very specific document that's issued from your raw material supplier of your fragrance and is done based on the evaluation and the information given from the IFRA standard. So all of this is working together, right, to basically give you the information you need on a fragrance that you use in your final product. Again, very important to note that existing, right, before that June 30th, 2023 date have until October 30th, 2025, which is this year in a few months, to be in compliance. So what that means is your existing products out on market, if they have a fragrance, their date to be compliant is by October 30th. So if you have not had a review of your existing products for the new 51st Amendment, you potentially can be you are out of compliance for this October 30th date. And that being said, this has already been being asked for. PCR has been asking for this information from the second that they had that notification date, and they had all the updated information for the IFRA 51st standard. What I feel a lot of us forget is like, yes, of course it's new, we're going to be compliant, but everything existing that's already out there also needs to have its review of it as well. And it has to, review any of the new restrictions or the specification standards as well. An IFRA certificate of conformity with the compliance is key into making sure you have proof to show that you've got your new statements for the 51st Amendment for your fragrance and flavor. You've had your review done, and you are in compliance for this October 30th, 2025 date. I know a lot of people that have already been working on all brands have been working on this pretty hard the last year, and making sure that this compliance, because there was a lot of significant changes, and we're going to go through those today, but especially with anyone who's in that personal care and uses a lot of fragrance at high levels, I mean, there are a lot of updates, which we're going to get into. Now, it looks like this could be very, very overwhelming, but it's important that you guys have this information and you understand how many changes have been made to the 51st Amendment. First and foremost, the updated guidance document for the use of the IFRA standards was updated. The IFRA standards that have been updated, right? So 32 restriction standards based on skin sensitization and systemic toxicity have been updated, right? And this is all new information that is coming in from scientific data, right? The IFRA team takes very much care into monitoring what type of fragrances are out there and what they're seeing, right, happen to consumers who are using it. 11 restriction standards based on dermal sensitization have also been updated. 2 restriction standards based on systematic toxicity have been updated. 1 restriction standard has been updated based on depigmenting potential. 1 restriction specification standard was updated based on dermal sensitization and systematic toxicity. 1 prohibited standard due to potential gene toxicity effects, and then also updates to the IFRA categories. We're going to go into that on the next slide. But this is a lot, right? And again, if you can see, it's all coming from scientific knowledge and scientific testing and safety assessments that are being done on these fragrance materials. The category update is going to be more significant, and we'll go into all of it, but I'll focus mostly on the parts for, cosmetics and personal care. But as you can see, I mean, 32 restrictions standards have been updated. That's a lot, right? 11 restriction standards have been updated in addition, right? So if you have not checked your existing, or if you have not been asking for your IFRA 51st, please take note that this is a significant change in the amendment and that your product should be checked. So these are relevant changes to the guidance documents specifically. So there has been added clarification about paper products, right? So clearer wording on how to apply the IFRA standards for paper products when calculating fragrance ingredient concentrations in finished products. There's also clarification about the category of fabric softeners, the dryer sheets, and also dry cleaning kits. Like I said, I'm going to talk a little bit about this because if this is something that falls in your company, it's good to know and have this information as well. I'd like to overshare information rather than house it in here, but very important to know that dryer sheets are now in a category 12. And again, there's the 12 categories, and then as we talk through, you'll understand there's subcategories that are within that as well. That category is where your finished product gets classified as, and that category then deems the safety assessment that you have for that fragrance material being used in that product. But again, so the dryer sheets are now in category 12, and they should be evaluated as such. The pillow spray is also now placing it in a category 11B. And this is really, more aligned with the skin and adverse event concerns for pillow sprays. I know a lot of brands that are in the cosmetic field. We use a lot of, we have those little extra things that, aren't technically cosmetics, but are used on products. So this could potentially be something that you have in your product line that you should be aware of. Also, reed diffusers, very huge. They're all over Instagram. They're all over the internet, right? So understanding the impactful changes to the levels that are being allowed to be used, and then also the category 10A that has been added to, and then the potential effect of the revised standards that it will have on those fragrances as well. Handling of traces. Very, very important. The Institute felt that the current text is not adequate regarding describing the certain roles and responsibilities of exchanging information across the supply chain on traces, right? And then also that information being passed along for traces in the finished consumer product. And I really agree with this too. I always ask for residuals and trace material, right? The supply chain, manufacturing process, right? And sometimes some of these things are missed, especially when it comes to fragrance components and fragrance ingredients. So that language being updated and deeming the roles and responsibilities of the transparency that's needed for trace materials will really affect, compositional breakdowns and the residual and trace documentation that has to be provided when you request that as a brand using a fragrance, right? So very important to make sure that you might need that updated information as well. There's also phototoxicity considerations for products in category 6. So the expert panel for fragrance safety concluded that the products in category 6 can be considered rinse off with regard to phototoxicity. The elimination of sunblock terminology in the guidance. The term sunblock is replaced with the term UV filters instead. So very, very important to know that terminology. Clarification that makeup remover for face and eyes also includes potential exposure to the lips. I think this one hit me the hardest. I've always said that, makeup removers, they touch everything. Every time I test a makeup remover, I always make sure I do an ocular with someone using contacts and someone with waterproof mascara. So right, everything has to be considered when you're using these like makeup removing products. But including the potential to exposure to lips. I mean, yeah, if you're wearing liquid lipstick and it's stuck on there and you're using that makeup remover to remove it, they were not considered to have exposure conditions compared to other products such as like a lipstick or a lip balm. But if a makeup remover is also suitable for lips, it's still considered similar to the makeup remover marketed for face as well, right? So very important to understand how your language is on your makeup removers, any potential warnings that you currently have, and definitely if that fragrance has a potential to be used on the lips or recommended to be used on the lips. Very important to understand that language, and if you have any fragrance in there, if you are complying with that category. Clarification about aftershaves of all types and category 4. This new description in the guidance document is aftershaves of all types, except those creams and some balms. Some aftershaves are creams and lotions products, so they might be categorized differently for the face, which is face moisturizers, right, in your category 5. So very important to understand these relevant changes in the guidance document, specific to clarification to categories and additional testing that has come up that potentially could, bring issues to your current products that are on market. So what does this impact really mean, right? What does this mean for me? This is a lot of information. There's a lot of restrictions. There's a lot of testing. I really, doesn't sound familiar to me. Very complicated science that's supposed to be helping me understand. So I wanted to kind of give you a slide to just kind of digest what I just went through and understand that, these clarifications, categories, limits, right? What does this all mean? So most limits included within the revised standards are more restrict now. No surprise, right? I feel as we keep moving along this regulatory chain, we just get more restricted. We get more, limits get lower, and potentially is moving us to a different type of way that we need to think about fragrance and flavors in our product. I am a huge fan of fragrance and flavors. A lot of the products I've worked with my entire career had some type of fragrance or flavor in it. So it's really important to understand, like, as we learn more about these fragrances and these flavors, that this is really coming from a safety perspective. All of us that worked 20 years ago in the labs, I don't even remember, I think, having a mask on or gloves or anything and touching all these, fragrances all the time, and different types of raw materials, right? This is really to move for safer products, right? For the chemists in us, for our consumers, for the brands. So never think about it as like, being limited or being restricted, even though those are the words that are being used. This is really moving towards to make sure that these fragrance materials are being used in a safe way. 48 new standards and 12 revised standards have implications for any fragrance ingredients and formulations that you create or used in a finished product. That is a lot. That is a lot to review. That is a lot to know. And again, I don't want to go back to that language about transparency. How much of, do you know about the fragrances that you use in your products, right? Do you have all this information? Do you have all your IFRA 51st Amendment paperwork? Do you have your fragrance safety evaluation, right? Do you have all this information? As someone using a fragrance, fragrances, it's important that a brand protects himself to have all this information. And I say that because there is a lot of, these limits and standards that being more restricted could really potentially change your entire fragrance profile for your product, especially if you are a fragrance by standalone. I also know that, when you're working with fragrance houses, they do their best to make sure that they're compliant as fast as possible. But that's not necessarily always the key, right? When something like a new amendment comes and so many things are updated and changed. And again, given that there's 48 new standards and 12 revised standards, it is essential to review each of these standards to determine that they may have an implication on anything that you use. If fragrance is not your expertise and this language is, difficult to understand, that is where you need to have, right, a safety assessor, a toxicologist, someone really who understands the implications of these standards and how they potentially could affect your product. One thing I want to note also is that some natural complex substances, also known as NCS limits, are also affected. So this would be the use of any basil, tarragon, and nutmeg. This is really, really important because some fragrances that you might be using would have these materials in them and you might not be aware, right? Because of all the different notes that fragrances have, right? And the different combinations of it. So very, very important, very important to look over your natural complex substances, if you have any, and to understand those new lower limits. When I saw basil and nutmeg, I immediately was like, oh my goodness, that's like a lot of products that are out there, because I see so many that advertise, right, this type of fragrance profile. So definitely need to consider those new lower limits. Phototoxicity now applies to rinse off products, where before it was mostly focused on the leave on products, but now this is going to be considered for rinse off products as well. We've always seen a lot of regulations, especially for EU, and of course those in California and in Canada, that for rinse off product there's less of a health risk, right? So we've seen higher limits, we've seen less testing needed, we've seen a lax thereof safety assessment versus a leave on product, right? Because the exposure is so it's much lower, right? Because you're rinsing the product off. But there is a lot to be said about the rinse off products now that are not just rinse off, right? It is a lot of keeping on for 30 minutes or keeping on for 15 minutes. I just got a brand new hair mask, right? And it told me to leave it on for an hour. And I was very surprised because that's a rinse off product. So, but it will be in my scalp for an hour. So this is where this consideration now has to start coming into play for these rinse off products, because yes, you do rinse them off. They're not like a foundation where you wear for 24 hours or not 24 hours, but 12 hours, right? Your mascaras. This is becoming a kind of new scope and new field for people who are working with these rinse off products. And that consideration really does have to come into play. And then again, very important to note that IFRA has relevant updates within existing categories as well. I went quickly through the categories before, but it's really, really important to understand how these categories truly affect of how you label your product and then how that fragrance gets used in your product. So what does this mean for enforcement? I want to speak specifically for the EU. Our PCR team is phenomenal. Like I said, we've been doing IFRA 51st since the second that they heard about it. The team is, very well versed with all the updates, with all the standards, and basically what needs to be done. There's numerous ingredients out there that can cause, allergies and sensitivities. And these are really found in those fragrance blends, right? So the EU takes a lot of care into their allergens lists, right? We just saw that whole change in their allergens list. And also the IFRA standards and amendments that they put into place, right? Because they are the experts, right? And they are the ones that have the safety assessments and the toxicologists and the teams that are able to provide this information. For the safety assessment protocol, right? So the safety assessors will request that the protocol is IFRA compliant. So when you have a product that has a fragrance in it, your responsible person, PCR, would request the IFRA 51st amendment document, right? These safety assessments, right, will have to be updated to reflect new clarifications, new limits, and new restrictions. Now, that being said, because there's so much changes in categories and even in those natural substance complexes, right? There might be additional paperwork that is needed as well, right? Handling of the traces, right? Did that documentation need to be updated because of the supply chain giving more information? And it's important to note that as these safety assessments and these traces and these limits get updated, this triggers, right? If there is an update that you have to make, this triggers a new CPSR, right? A new safety assessment, and potentially also a new label. And this is not something that is easily done, right? Even as much as I know about fragrances and everything, I am not a toxicologist, right? So I'm not a safety assessor. That is not my expertise. So even I would not feel 100% comfortable as a brand reviewing this on my own, right? This really needs to be done by a safety assessor, understanding the implications, understanding the changes that were made and how that directly affects the fragrance that's being used in the product. Again, with a CPSR and label update, this requires a new product information file update and an update to the notification as well. So this is like starting all over again in some cases where you need to make updates to limits and to restrictions and making sure that you are compliant with this IFRA 51st amendment. And that will require that update for the notification into the EU. And again, EU ensures that IFRA standards are being followed, right? Non-compliant products can be refused entry, they can have a product ban or a product destruction. The CPMP notification failure can endure fines, right? So if you really have, you're not compliant and you didn't make that change to your CPSR, to your label, to your PIF, and you didn't make that new notification, you are non-compliant. Penalties of products with non-compliant PIFs. Again, if you have not made these changes, you can be out of compliance. I do want to say that the CPSR for perfumes, the review process is at is subject to greater scrutiny. And I say that because there's such a heightened response to fragrances and flavors right now, that, and their adverse events and health risks, and all the changes that are being made, right? There is just such a higher scrutiny on it. So it's very important that your safety assessor considers like every possible interaction between the substances, the fragrance substances, in addition to evaluating the products separately as well. And that is why it's so important to pick a really, really skilled and knowledgeable, responsible person in the EU if you currently are not in the EU, because understanding even low concentrations of certain fragrances can cause, irritations or sensitivity. It's important, and it's important as a brand that, right? The last thing you want is a safety assessor not giving the scrutiny that these fragrances need, and you launching a product and you having hundreds of adverse events occur, right? This process is very lengthy. This process is brand damaging. And at the end of the day, you don't want your product to cause these adverse events. And IFRA is helping protect the safety of the product for that reason. And I hate bringing out the scary penalties and the fines, but it is important to understand that added compliance in the EU is very serious in terms of fines and product market bans and refusal of entry. And having not updated your CPSR, updated your label, updated your PIF, and having this updated notification will put you out of non-compliance. So I heavily, heavily urge anyone who has not done a proper assessment of IFRA and their products to reach out to us so that we can help you get on the path of compliance quickly, and making sure that review is done. So how can we help? Really, really important here is to understand PCR is, as Anne mentioned in the beginning, we have they have offices in the United Kingdom and in Ireland. For the changes with IFRA, we are making our clients aware of the changes that are happening. We just lost our screen. Hi, Anne.
All right, we just need to reshare the screen.
Okay, yeah, that's okay. You want to take us through how we can help? Kick it off?
Absolutely. Absolutely. All righty. Hey, what's a webinar without a technical glitch? Thank you, Jacqueline, for your very thorough presentation about IFRA and the 51st Amendment. As you all have seen, there's so much to it. There's a lot of changes. It's complex. There's a lot of just little differences that can impact your products. And as a cosmetic chemist myself, I know just how intricate these formulations can be. And then, okay, well, I'm trying to figure out what category we're in. Oh my goodness, am I at the right level? Because the last thing you want to do, as Jackie said, is you don't want to have an issue with compliance in the EU. They are one of the most restrictive of the geographic zones. So for the changes with the IFRA 51st Amendment, Registrar and PCR together, we can help you reassess your products, do a full review. As Jacqueline had said, some of the biggest points that need to be updated are the Consumer Product Safety Report, which needs a an EU certified registered toxicologist, which we have at our sites to help you with that. And additionally, the labels need to be updated for the increased allergen list and ensure any essential oils, fragrances, or flavors are within acceptable limits for their classification of the product against the updated IFRA 51st certificate. Along with that, we do a full review and assess your products that they are in the correct category. So those labels are then correct. And we'll do a full ingredient review for the new limits and restrictions. Along with that, updating one thing means updating CPSR, and labels means you need to update your PIF. That's your product information file. We do with these changes, the product needs to be fully updated with that, so your PIF documentation is updated there too. Once that's updated, which we can help you with that, the product needs a re-notification to the Consumer Product Notification Portal, CPNP, for the EU. So Say you're somewhere in the middle and you aren't starting from scratch and you need help when you're in process. We can help you with that too. That's our PIF due diligence service. And if you've already created CPSR but need additional help with other areas such as labels or maybe one or the other, we'll aid you through the compliance process and include a full PIF review done by our EU registered toxicologist specialist. And we also will help you gather the information that you need, such as the allergen certificates and declarations for the 51st Amendment, in addition to doing the CPNP notification for you. So we can help you along any process you have, any point along the process you are trying to go into the EU, or maybe you're just interested in going into the EU. We can get you, we can help you get started.
Great. I'm going to open it up for questions. I think, again, there's so much information. And I don't want anyone to feel overwhelmed. That's why we're here, right? We're the experts. I always say, right? Like, if I'm not an expert in something, I'm going to go find myself an expert in something. So that I need help with. So I definitely want you all to feel, not overwhelmed, understand that it's complicated, and understand that we're here to help. That is the beauty of this industry, right? There's always someone there to help. So we can have a couple questions. Here we go. Let's see. Having an IFRA certificate for fragrance is mandatory in Europe. Is it mentioned in the EU regulations somewhere? If a fragrance supplier cannot deliver the certificate, or if we use fragrance above the IFRA allow limit, could he perform a skin clinical test instead? So no, unfortunately, the fact that they don't have an IFRA statement is probably a little concerning. That's why it's really important to work with really reputable fragrance houses. And I say this because they know the IFRA standards, they have their safety assessors, they have their expert panels. And that is where, asking for an IFRA statement and them not being able to provide probably should lead you to ask a few more questions. The IFRA allowed limit, there is no option. And I've been in that situation. I've worked with RPs and I have been told to reformulate because we are above the IFRA standard, especially to bring it into the EU. So it is, important that you have that certificate. I'd be a little surprised if they didn't have that certificate even before, right? We're on the 51st Amendment, so there definitely should be more IFRA certificates that they have. I'm not 100% positive about performing your own skin clinical test instead. The Institute does this, and they have those safety assessors, and they're the ones that test, and they're the ones that are able to give those limits and provide the classification of why a certain fragrance material or ingredient is classified a certain way, restricted a certain way, and has a limit. And not every fragrance has a limit, right? There are some that max limit is 100, right? And you can use 100% of that. So it really comes into your fragrance supplier doing the proper assessment and having the IFRA statements that they have. You can't just take that product once the fragrance is in it and do your own skin clinical test and then determine it that way. Most fragrance houses I know, they have their material tested, right, to fall in line with the IFRA standards. So I would just maybe go back and double check with your fragrance supplier to make sure that they have an IFRA certificate. If not, please contact us. Maybe we can help you at least do some initial safety assessments and some tox reviews for that fragrance specifically. So there was also a question explaining the relevant changes to the guidance document for IFRA standards. Can you please clarify the example you use regarding makeup remover, specifically in relation to products used on the face, including those on the lips? So basically there was a clarification about certain makeup removers that are being used on the face that also potentially have risk to exposure to lips. And this is important, right? Because if we're thinking about a makeup remover, and I mentioned the liquid lipstick, right? So if you ever use a liquid matte lipstick, it like literally is like cement on your lips. So it's not as easy to get off because it's supposed to last you 36 hours, some of them claim, right? So are you potentially having that makeup remover be used on your lips as well? So the potential of risk of ingestion is higher. So I kind of I went through that scenario to basically say how your directions read on your packaging. Do you recommend it also being used on your lips? Do you recommend it all over the face, right? So that potential is where you need to consider a fragrance having exposure to the lips. And then that brings you into the lip category, right? Instead of the face category. These categories, there's 12 of them. They're designed specifically for the exposure to the certain face, body, eyes, lips, right? Because the potential exposure to those certain places on your body help determine the potential risk, right? So when you're doing a CPSR, right, and you're doing a safety review, the safety assessor will take in consideration the type of product, it's where it's used, and the potential of that health risk, right? So if you have a makeup remover for the face, right? What is the dermal exposure, right? And this is where all that margin of safety calculations come in. What is the dermal exposure of that product on your face, right? Of that fragrance material. That's how deep this goes, right? So every ingredient in your formulation, in your makeup remover, gets evaluated for its potential dermal exposure and potential safety risk, right? So if you have a makeup remover and there's no directions of like keep out of your mouth, or the potential that it is all over your face, right? So then that exposure kind of moves you into the lips, the potential for it to be exposed to your lips. Versus just your face. Categories are fully, you can literally Google search IFRA categories and it will break down all the different categories for you. In the 51st Amendment, that is where you're seeing some updates to those categories that I had discussed earlier. So there's just the potential that if you have a certain type of product that is, deemed in that category, doesn't necessarily mean it lives in that category still. But great question. I mean, again, I think it's really important to understand how your products use the directions and how your current safety assessment for EU reflects that ingredient, right? So if you have not had that assessed, right, for the potential exposure to lips, right, it could be a potential issue down the line if you are asked for your safety assessment and that has not been reviewed specifically for the makeup remover part, right? Not if you have a different product where there is no exposure to the lips. Let's see, another question. The deadline for the new safety assessment requirements understood for existing is October 30th. Do they have the same requirements for US and Canada and with MOCRA into consideration? Not 100% sure if you mean if IFRA complies with the US standard or MOCRA, but if you sell anything with a fragrance, I mean, this is global, right? This is a global type of statement for these products. I can tell you that if you're selling in the US and Canada, you should be following IFRA standards. And most retailers will request, especially if you have a fragrance product, your IFRA statements as well. Full IFRA compliance is needed in the EU 100%. MOCRA doesn't necessarily mention IFRA directly, and again, this is maybe something that will potentially come down the line. But I believe that's what your question was asking, so I apologize if that was not. But if you have a fragrance product, this is a global type of assessment for that fragrance. Now, is it enforced and restricted in other countries as heavily as the EU? I can't speak to that. I can't say that someone's banging down my door in New Jersey asking me my IFRA statement for my body lotion. But there is definitely a regard to if you're a global brand and you're selling your product globally to be following these IFRA standards. For EU, and we all know this, I mean, EU is one of the restrictive government bodies, right? And they do have a huge scrutiny on fragrances right now. We're seeing this as they develop, as they keep expanding the EU allergen list. And they are where everyone follows, right? Canada adopted it, California adopted it, right? So their restrictions on fragrance allergens and their scrutiny on fragrance materials, is really key to understanding that if you have a product that is not following those IFRA standards, and there is a health risk or potential safety issue, you are out of compliance for the EU. And that's kind of what Anne was trying to talk through before about, having this assessed and having this evaluated by people who understand, right, the safety assessors and toxicology that understand these limits, restrictions, and how that fragrance is being used. So let me see. One more, I think we have time for more questions. This is a big one, so I'm going to take it in parts. Regarding timings of compliance, is there anything we can do if the supplier sent the new IFRA amendment certificate late? Great question. What is late? So I actually just went through this about 3 months ago, where a supplier had not provided the IFRA amendment, the 51st Amendment statement. For the flavor that we were using. We were in full-blown panic because we knew that, it was an existing product. And if there was a change that we had to make it by October, right? And that is a part of, why you need to work with a responsible person like PCR. They're able to see a bigger picture, right, of the fragrance that you're using and potential risk associated with the level or limit that you're currently at for that specific fragrance, right? So that is why it's so key, to try to do this on your own or to wait for, suppliers to kind of provide this. One of the things, with PCR that was really important is when these IFRA amendments were late, right? The amendments that were already provided, right, from the IFRA amendments before, the team's able to look at those existing IFRA statements, look at the fragrance, look at the safety profile, right, and assess the risk of not having a 51st Amendment certificate. And that is what we just went through, right? And we were able to kind of, lower that risk on our behalf because of the team being so well versed with the 51st Amendment, with fragrance profiles and fragrance materials. Unfortunately, we sometimes can't help when a supplier is sending them so late, like, you said earlier in this year, right? So, and there's important changes to the percentage, right? Working with a responsible person that has this experience is really, really key. I think, and then you also mentioned aren't they obligated to inform us if the reference, if we use, suddenly becomes IFRA non-compliant with the new amendment? Correct. So they are obligated to inform you if there is a percentage change to their particular fragrance. It sounds like the supplier that you're working with probably was trying to work through the changes, the clarifications, and the new limit and restrictions. I've seen this mostly with the natural substance complexes. So like, remember the basils, the nutmegs, things of that nature. It is a much lower limit. And I feel that those were the suppliers struggling the most with trying to get a new IFRA certificate and clarifying the pieces and the levels and the testing that they needed. I don't know if this is your particular case, but that is the group that I saw mostly struggling. And then also those with like any type of farnesols, right? Like in their formulations, that has the limit is really reduced. So those are the ones that I saw delivering really late, like, earlier this year, as late as March, right? And if you have an existing product that you need to change that percentage, and October is the 30th is that compliance date, I mean, you're running really, really close. So not sure if you're working with an RP right now. Highly recommend, that you have someone or some, have PCR, our experts evaluate any products that you currently have. And it's a very unfortunate situation. And I'm so sorry you have to go through that. And that's a part of what these, why it's so important to have a really good partner. PCR was already flagging this, back in 2023, right? And we're in 2025, right? So 2023, we're flagging this to everybody. This is what we need. This is what we need to push your supplier. This is the document that we need to review. It's so important to have a partner like PCR, because they're able to tell you and alert you of this. The supplier of the fragrance was alerted way before. So it's a terrible situation when you're running into this. I'm seeing this also happen with the EU allergens as well. Many people are not prepared to be able to provide this new documentation, right? And how do you work through that, right? And that's where you have the potential risk of am I on this list? Am I going to be on this list? And our safety assessors, our toxicologists, like at PCR, have seen all of the different types of fragrances out there, and it's important, right? Again, to work with somebody who's able to see this on a daily basis. We're at the top of the hour. One of the best parts, and Anne can always say that, is if you have any questions, please follow up with us. We will get them answered. It is not an easy topic. I feel, I was speaking with Anne before presenting. I love all fragrances, and even this can be very overwhelming. It can be a lot of information, and as you can see, a lot of suppliers are not even providing a document until this year, with the compliance date at, in October. So if you do have any questions, if you have, need help, right, understanding, please reach out. John is just phenomenal. He will get you to the right person, and whether it be me or someone else, we will get your questions answered. Again, we want to, have everyone compliant everywhere in the world. But let's make sure we get your products compliant for IFRA by that October 30th date. And we can definitely help, as I just mentioned, if IFRA amendment is missing from your supplier, we can help, work you through that process, work you through that system, get a new CPSR, get a new label if you need it, get you a new PIP updated, and get your notification in. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. IFRA maybe not be the most exciting topic to talk about, but I had a blast talking about it with you all today. Look for more webinars. We're going to keep doing these throughout the year to give you all updates on EU and UK and what you need to do to become compliant. Thank you, everyone.